Thank you so much to Ben for giving me the opportunity to be virtually with you today. Of course, it's a great pleasure, but also a great sadness, as I would love to be there in the flesh and be able to actually exchange with you and continue over the 2 days of this conference. So I'll just go ahead and begin. In lieu of an introduction, I would like to start this paper by sharing an image with you. On Saturday afternoons, the Rue d'Orléans in the hypercenter of the French city of Nantes is swarming with people. On an axis leading from the Galerie Lafayette to the Royal Square, this pedestrian street looks like a black sea, full with people who came from the entire area to do some shopping or simply have a good time downtown. But since November 2018, every Saturday, this black swarm would intersect with another bright yellow stream, marching down the Cour des 50 Étages, an avenue which runs perpendicular to this first street. As you would walk down from the top of the Rue d'Orléans towards the city center, you would get this very graphic image of a yellow stream intersecting with a black stream, forming two perfectly perpendicular axes of distinctive colors, the bright yellow axis separating the black one in two halves. And yet, through some optical mystery, it looked as if this black stream, though cut into halves, was still running uninterrupted. The continuous fluxes of people walking up and down the street made it look as if the eastern and western parts of the street had not been disconnected, as if people had never been disturbed in their trajectories towards their shopping, as if an invisible passage had allowed this black stream to run subterraneously without ever encountering this yellow fellow stream of citizens, as if those perpendicular streams would intersect but never meet. And this image of perpendicular fluxes kept returning as I was thinking about this talk and the question of libidinal economy today, along with this very naive and primarily optical question: why did these two disconnected segments of black swarm kept swarming as one single continuous stream, as if undisturbed by the disruption that yet cut its course? And of course, there is at least one concrete answer ready at hand. The yellow stream was very strictly contained by a massive police presence. And while business could go on as usual in the rest of the city center, the flux of the yellow vests would be contained within one single avenue by large contingents of police persons in full gear, as well as agents of the anti-criminality brigades. Business could go on as usual amongst the sound of grenades and the stench of tear gas. But then again, how come this black stream of shoppers and passers-by would seem to keep swarming undisturbed when sometimes 4 or 5 meters away from them, demonstrators would be held at gunpoint, drenched in tear gas, chased, held down, beaten up, or even strangled? Although I will actually speak about the vicissitudes of Jean-Francois Lyotard thinking of libidinal setups and not about the yellow vest movements, I would like to situate my talk against this backdrop of the strange non-intersection of two perpendicular fluxes, the yellow stream of disruption and the black stream of continuation. Within the context of this conference, which sets out to inquire about the relevance of the libidinal economic framework today, it seemed opportune to observe the trajectory of this framework across the works of one of its notorious theorists, who just as notoriously abandoned the libidinal approach in favor of a pragmatics of phrases in the différent and onwards. The libidinal approach developed in the 1970s was now deemed a metaphysics of forces, and affect was reframed as affect phrase. But upon closer look, this opposition of two frameworks is not as clear-cut as it seems, or as it is usually assumed. The libidinal often resurfaces in Lyotard's late prose, coexisting alongside with other frameworks in more than one text. As we reassess the relevance of the libidinal framework for today, what can be learned from Lyotard's own reassessment? Let me start then by recalling the framework that Lyotard himself later felt the need to reassess. In August 1971, that is 2 years prior to the publication of the infamous Libidinal Economy, Lyotard wrote an introduction to a book that was never published. The introduction was published, but the book was never published. And the book should have been a sort of history of the movement of March 22nd. This movement was named to commemorate the start of the occupation of the administrative building of the University of Nanterre in protest against the arrest of 6 activists against the Vietnam War. So long story short, it was the beginning of May 68 in France. And in this text, this introduction to an unpublished book titled March 23rd, Lyotard elaborates his thinking of the event in relation to what he already calls the system, which he defines as a regulator of energies. I quote, "One can imagine any society as an ensemble of persons ruled by a system whose function would be to regulate the entry, the distribution, and the elimination of the energy that this ensemble spends in order to exist. Objects would be specifications, concretions of this energy. Institutions would be operators that make this energy usable by the ensemble, make it circulate within. The institution, far from being only what presents itself as such to the observer, would in general be any stable formation, explicit or not, transforming incoming energy into bound energy within a given field of the circulation of objects." End of quote. Societies are defined as governed by such systems that capture or eliminate energies. Economic systems of exchange and social institutions are considered as such energetic setups. Capitalism is but one of such systems of regulation, which has the property of being structured as a regulator of growth. That is, it allows in principle the introduction and elimination of ever-increasing quantities of energy. And in this context, Lyotard proposes to define an event as follows. I quote, "One could call an event the impact on the system of floods of energy, such that the system does not manage to bind and channel this energy." In the case of the capitalist system, an event would be defined by the fact that the incoming energy would no longer let itself be captured, bound, or circulated in the objects of the system. Such would be the case, for instance, with crisis of overproduction, in which the quantities of energy are too important to be processed by the system. And Lyotard notes that while these crises of overproduction can gravely endanger the system, such crises as that of 1929 end up reinforcing the system. For their analysis, I quote, "provides the system with the chance to improve its capacity to bind energy." However, next to this quantitative order of events, Lyotard notes the existence of a much more enigmatic, qualitative sort of events, in which the impossibility to channel the incoming energies does not lie with the overabundance of these energies, but with the qualitative incapability of the regulating system itself, which used to function, but inexplicably no longer does. Here, and only here, enters the libidinal framework. And the analogy between these energetic economic setups and the libidinal setup of the psychic apparatus is set in place. As Freud defines it in the Project for a Scientific Psychology, the psychic apparatus in itself is such a regulator of libidinal energies. It captures or represses the unbound energies of the drives. In drawing this analogy between his energetic account of the regulation of societies and the libidinal economy laid out by Freud, Lyotard posits that any social system is underpinned by a position of desire. he writes, the object that appears within the system are set up so that desire is fulfilled in their production and in their destruction. The energetic setup, the energetic system that regulates societies, is now a system that channels libidinal fluxes into objects. This allows Lyotard to attempt to provide an explanation for the second mysterious qualitative order of events. It is an inexplicable mutation in the position of desire, whereby desire can no longer be fulfilled or captured, that is, repressed or foreclosed, in the objects that use to channel them. To Lyotard, the specificity of the movement of March 22nd would lie in such a modification of the position of desire. I quote, "It owes its proper dimension to the space that it has created, even though it is minimal and violated by ideologies, for a mutation in the relationship between what is desire and what is given, between potential energy and the social machinery." End of quote. The force of May 68 would have been to create a modification of the ways in which the capitalist system channels energies and desire, in ways that it would hint at a possible undoing of the system. And Lyotard even says, or dares to say, yet with immense precautions, the collapse of the system. Yet it would be a mistake to understand this utopian opening as an optimistic acclaim of spontaneous alternatives to bureaucratic systems. At that time, and although he cooperated actively to the movement of March 22nd, which partly drew its inspiration from the radical Marxist orientations of socialisme ou barbarie, Lyotard had already left that group, and he was in the process of finding ways to mourn the faith in a Marxist alternative, or any kind of revolutionary alternative. Hence the discomfort that is sensed throughout this text, March 23rd, because it lays out a libidinal theory that attempts to account for the event of May 68 as opening the space for a possible alternative, while being wary of all existing practical and theoretical alternatives imaginable, may they be bureaucratic, spontaneous, or whatnot. Even though this introduction to an unpublished book was published as such in Dérive à partir de Marx et Freud, in English it's the book Driftworks, it is obviously unsatisfactory. In particular, the mystery of the possible causes for qualitative mutation of the position of desire, whereby the regulatory system would no longer be able to bind the incoming energies, remains intact. And as we have seen, in the possibility of such a qualitative mutation actually lies the very possibility of a mutation of the system itself. In December 1993, that is, well after he supposedly abandoned the libidinal framework, Lyotard wrote a whole new introduction for the re-edition of Des dispositifs pulsionnels, libidinal setups, which was originally published in 1973 or 4. And in this introduction, he takes up again the notion of libidinal setup. Among many important new specifications, the recontextualization of Freud's initial materialist hypothesis of the drives allows Lyotard to connect the libidinal framework with biological and social systems through an extension of the principles of entropy and negentropy. Freud could draw from Darwin's and Spencer's hypotheses regarding the living as energetic systems, just as Darwin and Spencer themselves were able to draw the systemic hypotheses from the first theoreticians of economic liberalism, Malthus, Smith, and Ricardo. Freud's materialist hypothesis is not a mere analogy. Representing the psychic apparatus according to the model of an energetic system allowed him to graft the dynamics of the soul directly on the dynamics of living and social bodies. The psyche, the social, the organic, these are not separate fields bound by a mere analogy. These are actually different types of material systems of organized energy. All matter, writes Lyotard, is energy concretized in a system. Some systems are enormous, such as the galaxies. Others, such as unicellular terrestrial beings, are minuscule. But all are subject to the principle of entropy. When the incoming energy runs out, the internal differentiation can no longer be sustained, and the system disappears in chaos. Eros and the death drive are mutatis mutandis, psychoanalytic names for negentropy and entropy. And from unicellular beings to post-human computers, Lyotard considers evolution as one long, continuous history of complexification, of which the human psyche is but one stasis. A complexification which he imagines in postmodern fables shall continue until the big solar explosion destroys the Earth in 4 billion years. And of course, we would have to reassess this idea in view of the current climate crisis. Within this picture, the capitalist setup is no longer one among various ways to regulate energies, as it was in the earlier understanding of libidinal setups. It is now regarded as the latest and most up-to-date form of organization of one ever-complexifying energetic system. Because it has the advantage of over other forms of organization, to be able to always adapt to the increasing of the quality of the performances of the system, Lyotard now views this form of organization as irreversible. All crises, quantitative or qualitative, are occasions to improve its efficiency. The law of the market is the main regulator of this system, and yet, while competition should be tempered so that the system remains tolerable to the humans of which it is composed, claims Lyotard, as a way of preempting crisis, as it were. And Lyotard notes that erratic energies are not merely mechanically channeled, but that this channeling is always rushed by the anxiety of a submersion of the system, a submersion that would actually lead to its annihilation. In this updated libidinal framework, the qualitative hypothesis, according to which the regulatory system may undergo a mutation, has disappeared. It has disappeared in favor of strictly quantitative considerations, through which Lyotard identifies the main challenges that the system will face in the new millennium, i.e. today, and which we are indeed all too well familiar with. I quote, "After the crisis of 1929, it became obvious that world capitalism had to find remedies to the so-called overproduction, other than speculation, unemployment, totalitarianisms, and ultimately the massacre of about 60 million human beings. After its reconstruction, the system functioned in the euphoria of its growth and the forgetting of its crimes. But now it happens that it finds itself confronted at the turn of the millennium, and for a long time, to a double deadly threat. The necessity of integrating and employing the potential energies localized in the third world and in what is left of the second after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the urgency of solving the question, this time internal, of employment within the so-called developed regions of the world, where techno-scientific development makes an ever-increasing proportion of the traditional human workforce once and for all useless." End of quote. And let me return here for a second to my initial image of the yellow stream. If we consider the Yellow Vests movement as an event in the sense of Lyotard, that is, in the sense of a flood of energies that would that would be such that the regulating system does not manage to process or bind those energies, then this event is quantitative, it's not qualitative. Sociologically, this heterogeneous movement is composed of precarious or pauperized workers from the lower middle class with no prior activist experience. They belong to a group that used to take pride in working hard and making do, but are now demanding that their lives not merely be considered as energies to feed the system, a demand that is all in all quite minimal. It is not a demand for a revolution of the system, it's a demand for a reform that would allow their inclusion in the system. It seems to me that this movement only confirms Lyotard's observation that social struggles today are no longer struggles to conquer more rights, but struggles to defend the rights that were already acquired. And this makes the violence of the repression that they have encountered all the more worrisome. It seems to me that the point of a libidinal economic analysis today does not lie in a libidinal analysis of forces of disruption, but rather in the global understanding of the apparatus whose continuation no longer relies on their integration, but on their elimination. At the end of his new introduction to the dispositif pulsionnel, which I was just referring earlier, Lyotard further reflects upon possible outcomes to the quantitative challenges that he had identified. I quote again, "The stakes of the coming centuries appear to be clear. To reorganize the setups designed to channel forces, to prepare the system to integrate much more energies than those that, that are available presently. And to that end, to accept to spend part of those energies in order to make those future energies useful. It will be necessary to incorporate the people of underprivileged regions within the global market, and on the inside, at the same time, to redistribute work in diminishing working hours, and everywhere to slow down demographic growth. Who can say that such a challenge will be overcome and how? Will it be possible to avoid new massacres? Will the principle of international law not soon appear inappropriate for a good management of fluxes?" End of quote. Obviously, the thousands of people who died at the gates of Europe, the walls built throughout the West, as well as the number of people maimed or even killed in the repression of democratic movements in France 25 years after this text was written, provides a negative answer. Through an irony of history, the avenue down which the yellow vests of Nantes keep marching is called Avenue of the 50 Hostages, in memory of the 48 hostages killed by the Nazis in retaliation against the assassination of the regional Feldkommandant by a resistance group in October 1941. Of course, the official hagiography usually omits the fact that the list of hostages was provided to the occupying forces by the Vichy regime itself, who made sure that it would be composed of communists rather than good citizens. This coincidence provides me with an admittedly abrupt transition and leads me to consider how Lyotard elaborates his thinking of the system in relation to the problem of totalitarianism. In 1988, he was invited to speak about the works of Hannah Arendt at the Goethe Institute in Paris. The text was republished under the title Survivant, i.e. surviving or survivor. He devotes the end of that text to a consideration of her treatment of totalitarianism in a way that unexpectedly brings into play the libidinal framework. He starts by describing the comparison drawn in the crisis of culture between the organization of the totalitarian system and the structure of an onion. So with authoritarianism, power is hierarchical, structured like a pyramid. With tyranny, power is in the hands of one, the rest being equally powerless. But with the totalitarian onion, the leader resides at the core, the rest being surrounding this core in concentric strata. And the more these strata are removed from the center, the less radical they appear, the more realist, according to Arendt, and vice versa when considered from the outside. Each strata appears more committed, more radical, the closer they are to the core. Such structure, according to Arendt, would allow the totalitarian system to be sheltered from the potential threats posed by the factuality of the real world. Because this onion-like structure aims at shielding the system from factual events, Lyotard suggests that totalitarianism functions like an organism designed to block excitations. He writes, politics claims to be able to change reality. Totalitarian politics claims to be able to change it totally. Hence the onion, which is a system designed to filter reality completely, back and forth, in order to transform reality into ideology or culture. End of quote. At this point, Lyotard departs from Arendt's analysis to develop his own hypothesis. To him, it is not the factuality of reality that requires to be filtered, but the excitations it produces, its tenor in anxiety. But what within the so-called real world can be so anxiety-producing that it could lead to the extermination of millions? To Lyotard, the external description of the workings of a totalitarian system is insufficient, as it is a mere description. The mere description in libidinal terms as an apparatus of repression or filtering is insufficient as well. He aims at locating the source of such an anxiety. And to him, facts or groups of people are not by nature in themselves anxiety producing. They only produce anxiety and activate mechanisms of repression insofar as they awake something foreclosed at the core of the system. And of course, I'm very aware that time is running out and I will not have the time to outline this in detail. So let me just say that Lyotard, based on the thinking of originary repression and Machtreglichkeit, which actually no longer relies on a libidinal framework as such, postulates at the core of the West an immanent terror that is not identified as such, an unconscious affect that escapes the grasp of consciousness and is forever irrepresentable. And in his text on Arendt, he concludes that the thing, here in a Lacanian sense, must prove itself quite threatening for a foreclusion apparatus as powerful as totalitarianism to be made necessary and possible. And it is there that the origins of totalitarianism must be found, end of quote. He also concludes by suggesting that this source of the spirit of totalitarianism did not run dry with the defeat of historic totalitarian regimes. And indeed, he identifies possible ways in which the spirit of totalitarianism can survive. Do I have more time? How much time do I have?
Less than 5 minutes.
Okay, that will do it. So I will be very brief. First, Arendt shows that totalitarian systems do not hold their power from professional criminals, but from a well-organized mass of conscientious employees. To Lyotard, these Philistines are ordinary souls who don't want to hear anything about the relationship to nothingness or an ontological depth. Busyness is precisely a way to look away. And of course, Lyotard suggests that this is just as true in the 30s than it is today, or at the end of the 20th century, where the forces of the mind are put to use and exclusively geared toward the so-called active life, and indeed to business and entertainment. Second, in the totalitarian system, Arendt argues that terror is the realization of laws of movement, whose aim is neither the well-being of human beings in general, nor the interest of one person in particular, but the fabrication of humankind. With totalitarianism, nature or history are no longer sources of authority stabilizing the actions of people, but they are thought of as movement. They are suprahuman forces that justify that terror be mobilized to realize their law, that justified that groups of people be eliminated to allow for the fabrication of humankind. All energies are mobilized towards that goal. In 1988, Lyotard claims that the contemporary system no longer requires for the law to be broken or for lives to be exterminated. Development is a law of movement which maximizes the total mobilization of all energies according to a criterion of performativity. All forces are mobilized against entropy. And following Ernst Jünger, he argues that the democratic system and the improvement of the law towards the elevation of life standards is a much more powerful tool for mobilization than the totalitarian tools of the 1930s, because they are much more acceptable by ordinary people. Interfaces are multiplied, no longer according to the structure of an onion, but now in networks. Delays between stimuli and responses are reduced to a level where they become imperceptible. Everything happens in real time. In the contemporary system, space and time are saturated. Lyotard suggests that this very saturation itself is designed to fend off excitations, to repress anything that would diminish the efficiency of the system. I quote, "Massification, mobilization, and saturation, forclusion can be obtained at a much lesser cost through the organization in communication networks than through totalitarian politics. I know how brutal this diagnosis sounds. I know that development is indeed a development with respect to traditional society. I know the advantages of democracy," end of quote. Of course, Lyotard's analysis does not amount to equate naively the system of contemporary development with historic totalitarian regimes. In demonstrating certain analogies in their structures, as well as similitudes in their function with respect to this immanent terrifying source, Lyotard suggests that one of their key differences lies in the fact that development does not rely on terror to realize the law of its movement. But this does not mean that it structurally excludes terror. It means that it does not need to resort to terror as long as democratic life provides for the more efficient mobilization of energies. So where to go from there? Of course, it would be necessary to reassess Lyotard's later hypotheses according to the present situation. I will not do that. Let me just make a couple remarks in the face of the new surge of anxiety and reviviscence of terror that we seem to be facing today. First, as I hope to have shown, Lyotard excludes alternatives to the system. There are only better or worse ways of channeling energies. The system accommodates itself perfectly of right-wing populist movements. These do not actually challenge the efficiency of the system. Their racism, their walls and borders, on the contrary, reinforce it as they allow to eliminate surplus fluxes of humans whose energies are no longer useful to the system. And on the contrary, when the discontent that was caused by the workings of the system expresses itself as a demand for more democracy and the respect of human rights, then these demands must be repressed. They endanger the system as democracy and the law no longer contribute to the increasing of the efficiency of the system, but they rather tend to slow it down. Second, the climate crisis. Lyotard saw as the main threat for the system the explosion of the sun in 4 billion years. And of course, one could object, but the climate crisis right now shows that he was wrong. And the system actually contradicts itself. Technoscientific development is supposed to work towards negentropy, not entropy. It is not supposed to run the system into chaos. Well, I would like to agree, and I would like to see a potential for alternatives there, or proof that Lyotard, in his postmodern fables, indeed wrote fables and nothing more. But I'm in a quite pessimistic mood today. So I wonder to which extent the climate crisis will not in itself benefit the system. It's said now that 1.3 billion people will be most directly affected and indeed have their lives put at risk. And we know, of course, that these lives are mostly located in the South. The climate crisis might provide a chance to the system to yet again regulate flows of energy. And with the current inaction in face of the crisis, this is exactly, it seems to me, where we are heading. And this was it.